It is what it is.
It is what it is.
Okay, next we're going to bring up the Texas Longhorns, and we're going to use the same evaluation system. Who they beat, who they beat in conference, who they beat out of conference, who they beat at home, who they beat on the road. First game was an incarnate word. They're 8-23 this year. Bad team. So we're off to a bad start with the Texas Longhorns. Next was Delaware State. They beat them 86-59 on the 10th of November. They were under 500 this year. So 2 for 2 on under 500 teams. The Texas scheduled already. Now they play Rice every year on the 15th of November. Won that game 80-64. Let's check out Rice. Rice was under 500 this year. Okay. So 3 straight under 500 teams to start the season. Next, they play at a classic at the Garden against Louisville and won that game 81-80. So that's their first test this year. Although Louisville was really bad this year, under 500 and really bad. That's what I wrote down in my notes, really bad. So next up was UConn in that same classic, and they lost that game in a valiant effort, 71-81. So we're talking neutral sites, 2 straight neutral sites games, and it was Louisville and UConn. They lost the UConn game, and which is expected. UConn is the best team in the country, in my opinion. Next is Wyoming. Now, Wyoming, they played that game at home. My notes for Wyoming were they were under 500. They were really bad. Next, we move on to Texas State. At home, 77-58, another win. And they were under 500 and bad. This is what I mean. Texas, first 8 or 9 games, other than the Classic. And these are wins. These are wins on their record. They're 20-12. These are wins. And these are bad teams they're playing. They're playing the whole Texas. Everybody in Texas they're playing, which they usually do. But these are bad teams. Out of conference, bad teams. This is the out of conference record. Marquette. Oh, they played this game in Milwaukee, so this is a home game for Marquette. Lost that game 65-86. So that was a blowout victory for Marquette. So even though it was good for their non-conference scheduling, they didn't win that game. And next is Houston Christian. They won that game 77-50 and played them at home. And they were under 500 this year, and they were really bad. That's my notes for Houston Christian. 77-50 against Houston Christian at home. At least they play them in Houston. Houston Christian had to come to Austin and get beat, and they were a really bad team this year. And that seems like that was a neutral site at a Toyota Center where the Rockets play. Won that game 96-85 on the 16th of December. And that's a nice little victory at the time. Let me see what I wrote about LSU. 17-15, 500 in conference. That's their best win up to this point. Out of conference victory. That's their best win. Now we move on, but LSU's not a tournament team. Now we got Texas A&M Corpus Christi. They beat them 71-55, and now Corpus Christi was 21-11 this year and second in their conference, but they didn't win the conference tournament, so they're not going to the tournament this year. So that's a nice little victory. UNC Greensboro 72-37 in Austin. Didn't even go to Greensboro. In Austin, but Greensboro was 21-11. They're not a tournament team this year. But they had a nice little season. Here we got Texas at Arlington. They beat the Longhorns beat them 79-62 on the 1st of January on New Year's Day. Beat them at home. And Texas and Arlington, they're not a tournament team, but they were over 500 this year, 20-14. And they were probably over 500 in their conference as well. Played them in Austin and lost that game 67-78. And Texas Tech is a tournament team. So their first real test in conference, they lost at home. Now we're moving on to Cincinnati. They beat Cincinnati 74-73 on the 9th of January. And that was in Cincinnati. So at the time, that was a good win. And Cincinnati was under 500 in the conference. They were at a 20-14 record. They were a middling team in the Big 12 this year. So at that time, that was a good win. But it proved to be that Cincinnati's not a tournament team. But that was a good win at the time. They lost in West Virginia. West Virginia is the worst team in the Big 12, one of the worst teams in the country. And they lost that. That's a horrible loss for them. At the time, I don't know what West Virginia's record was at the time. But that's a horrible loss for Texas. And now we got UCF, 71-77. Lost that game at home against UCF. Let's see what UCF did this year. What did I write down in my notes? 17-15, under 500 in conference. Bad loss. The meat of their schedule. Right now, they're not a tournament team in my eyes. Remember, who you beat at home, who'd you beat on the road, who'd you beat in conference, who'd you beat out of conference. Now we got Baylor. Oh, here's their big win. At home, Baylor, nail biter 75-73. And Baylor is a top 4 seed this year. I don't know if they're 3 or 4. I don't know offhand if they're 3 or 4. But they are a top 12 to 15 team in the country. So that's a good win for them. Huge win. Their best win of the season. So now we move on to Oklahoma on the 23rd of January. And they beat Oklahoma convincingly 75-60. And Oklahoma's not a tournament team. They were a middling Big 12 team this year, probably under 500. Yeah, under 500 at 20-12, but under 500 in conference. So that's another good win for them. So 2 straight good wins, but one of them are a tournament team. Oklahoma's not a tournament team. Then they go at BYU, lose to BYU. Then they go on to Houston and lose to Houston in OT at home, 72-76 on the 29th of January, and lost that game. So their biggest test, they lost at home, but a valiant effort, a tournament-like effort. Still up to this point, Texas is not a tournament team. And Houston is a top 3 team in the country, although I will put out a video about Houston. Houston can't score. So although they're a top 4 team in the country, have a number 1 seed, they're not getting out of their region. They're an elite defensive team, but they cannot score. A team that can score mid-range 3 points, they will beat Houston. TCU, they won that. The Longhorns won that game 77-66 at TCU. And that's their biggest road victory up until this point. And TCU, I believe, is a tournament team, although I will reserve judgment on TCU because I want to put out a video about them and their schedule as well. But up to this point, this is probably their biggest road victory. Yeah, I think that's their biggest road victory up to this point. So right now, you would say maybe they're a middling tournament team, maybe a 10th seed, something like that. Definitely not something where they're comfortably in. Iowa State, that's a top 10 team in the country, top 6 or 7 team in the country. Iowa State, they lost that game at home, so I'm not gonna hold Texas for that. But they lost that game. That's a game they lost. You don't count that as a victory. That's good on their strength of schedule, but that's not a victory against Iowa State. Beat them. West Virginia, they beat West Virginia. We already discussed, aforementioned. West Virginia is the worst team in the Big 12. So beating them convincingly, 94-58, doesn't really do anything in terms. It helps their record, but that's a non-win in my book. And they already lost to West Virginia. So they split West Virginia this year. They got blown out by Houston in Houston, 61-82. We already said Houston's regarded as one of the top 4 teams in the country, and so that's not going to count against them. Kansas State, they beat Kansas State 62-56 on the 19th of February. What do I have written about Kansas State? Under 500 in conference. So that's an okay win. You know, just another okay win. Texas always gets those okay wins. A lot like Michigan State, by the way. Okay, at Kansas, 67-86. Big loss at Kansas. And we know Kansas, with their big, they're a top 10 team in the country. Without them, they're barely a top 20 team in the country. Can't score. So I don't recall if their big played on the 24th of February or not. because he's been hurt for a while now. But if he didn't play, this was a bad loss. Now we got Texas Tech. Texas Tech, they beat them 81-69. We already talked about that. They're a tournament team, so that's a big win for them. A nice win. Oklahoma State on March the 2nd, 81-65. That's a win. Oklahoma State, what I've written by the. Oh, they're a bad team. That's what I wrote down. Bad team. So they must be under 500 in conference and under 500 for their season record. So they split the season series with Baylor, and they beat Oklahoma on the 9th of March, 94-80, last game of the season. So they swept Oklahoma. So their big wins are Oklahoma twice. They swept Oklahoma, beat TCU once, beat Baylor once, and beat Texas Tech once. And they lost to BYU and got swept by Houston, and West Virginia beat them once. It was the worst team in the conference. They're barely a tournament team. Just barely. I wouldn't be surprised if they were out of the tournament. Definitely not a number 7 seed. They're a number 7 seed. That means you're comfortably in. Their big wins are Oklahoma twice, who's not a tournament team, TCU once, Baylor once, which are probably at home, and Texas Tech once. That's not enough. That's not enough. I'm looking at Incarnate Word, Delaware State, Rice, Louisville, Wyoming, Texas State, Houston Christian. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bad teams. That's 7 victories of their 20. Horrible teams. LSU, which were 500. It's a nice victory. This is not a tournament team. They're not a tournament team. Because the Big 12 got 8 teams in, and Texas is one of those teams. You could have took one of those teams out and put a Big East team in there and put another ACC team in there. Pittsburgh's better than Texas. Clemson is better than Texas. Seton Hall is better than Texas. Dare I say it, St. John's is better than Texas. These wins aren't impressive. Oklahoma twice? Who did Oklahoma beat out of conference? Who did TCU beat out of conference? You know, I'm going to do a video on TCU because we got to do the same thing I did for Texas because I got to evaluate if this win means something. But they're definitely not. If they're a tournament team, they're definitely not a 7 seed. They're a 10 seed, 11 seed. But when you over-evaluate a conference or overvalue a conference, so, you know, everybody gets in. They were thinking about putting Oklahoma in, you know? And so, from my estimation, Texas shouldn't have been in. But if they do get in, they're 10 seed, 11 seed. They're not a 7 seed waiting on the winner of such and such, Virginia and whoever.